the Amorites pressed the sons of Dan into the hills, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. What is going on here? God said he's going to go before them. Why aren't they conquering these people? So that's the big question that should be in everybody's mind. Hello and welcome to Applicata Biblia. My name is Mark, and thank you so much for stopping by as we get a little bit into God's Word. And we are continuing in the series of characters in the Bible, or a walk through the Bible. And we are in Book 2, Lesson 25. Now, I'm going to put up a graph that kind of shows where we are. So far, we've covered all of the Pentateuch, and we've covered all of Joshua. Now, with Joshua, we've only covered a couple of items in there. So, just as a matter of reference, this is not a deep dive into every book. This is just a 30,000-foot view of the scriptures, so we can see kind of historically what's going on during this time and what's going on. We don't get into the minutia of every single event, and that's, that you lose a lot, right? You really do lose a lot. I prefer to do a book review with my classes. I think that is much better than this, which is more topical. Topics are great, and they're helpful. But for this is developed for maybe a 1 to 2 year period. Actually, it's a kind of like a 2 year period where you can go through the Bible with students and look at the historical narrative as well as how God is dealing with his people. And that's all this is. So I just want to put that out there, that's what this is for. So yeah, we're going to, there's a lot more in the book of Joshua that I didn't cover. There's a lot more in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, all of those books that I didn't read through. I only just touched on a few people and a few things in there. Okay, so what are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to look at today is we left off where in the book of Joshua, even though Joshua was leading them, we saw how Achan he sinned and caused his family to suffer because of it, and the issues with that. And so what we're going to see almost immediately in Judges, and this is where we're going to the book of Judges in chapter 1, 2, and 3. We're not going to cover the whole thing. I'm just going to give us a synopsis of what's going on so we can see the patterns that happen in the scriptures that God wants us to see. We see these patterns over and over and over again, not because God is going, see, you guys just mess up all the time. That's not it. I mean, it kind of is, but really the overarching trajectory of the message is you need faith. And mankind without faith, without real faith in God, you're going to fail. And that is the repeated message over and over and over and over again. And here's Israel. They've been dealing with God, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And this is where we're going to pick up, right? So they've gone into this promised land. They came from the east side, and they had to cross the Jordan. And they left some of the tribes over there. And this is what they're doing. They are conquering these lands and installing different tribes in different areas so they can rule themselves there. Actually, God is their ruler, but they kind of have land that they are to manage, and God is always supposed to be centered to their life. God makes that very clear in Deuteronomy. And so they cross over the Jordan. There are some tribes that will have land east of Jordan. But they have to go over and they have to help their brothers conquer this other land first. And so they leave their women and children and probably some older children to help take care of the families east of Jordan. And so they go into Jericho, we talked about that, and they go in, and then they're in the middle of conquering the land, and they've done, when you go through Joshua, you see one victory after another and how God is dealing with that, how they are taking over the land like they're supposed to. Then we start seeing some issues. So in chapter 1, it talks about, when Joshua dies. Now, it talks about it later in the book of Judges as well. So it's kind of one of those things that at this part of the story, after Joshua dies, here's what happened, and then it'll say the same thing again later. It's just giving it as a reference point. So in chapter 1, we start seeing that even though God is with them and they're conquering, they're doing really well, all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, because they have issues all the time, we see that they are not dispossessing the people like they're supposed to. And so that raises the red flags for anybody who's reading it as to what's going on. And one of the main stories in chapter 1 is the story of Othniel. Now, Caleb talks about, he says, if anybody can take this city, they can have my daughter's hand in marriage. And so Othniel goes and does that. He takes over the city. So we see this marriage of Othniel and Caleb's daughter. Now, it's important to note because Othniel is going to be a judge. That's why that story is so important. And it's interesting to note what also happens because his daughter actually kind of negotiates some land for them. So, she goes to him and says, how about if we get this over here? And he's like, okay. So, it's kind of important to see that because, we tend to think that women in the Old Testament were just chattel. They were treated like property, and they kind of were. But many times we see that they are also very highly respected. But by the time we're getting to, there's a lot of things that are going in, like verse 21, sons of Benjamin did not possess the Jebusites, and the Jebusites become big. And that's the main thing that we're seeing here. People are not going to be dispossessed. They're not going to be conquered like God said they needed to be, and they're going to become problems. Manasseh did not, in verse 27, they did not dispossess Beth Shean and its daughter villages, or Tanakh and its daughter villages, nor strike the people in Dor. So we see again, Manasseh not doing what they're supposed to do. They do, however, enslave the people instead of killing them off like God expected them to do. They don't conquer them, but they are strong enough to make slaves of them. So this, that kind of brings up some questions as to why, maybe you should have just done what God told you. Ephraim doesn't, in verse 29, does not possess the Canaanites. 30, Zebulun does not dispossess the inhabitants of Kitron. And there's a lot more. I'm just reading really quick in chapter 1 of Judges. And the Asherites live among the Canaanites, and that's these idolatrous religions. Naphtali did not dispossess the ones living in Beth Shemesh, and their issues. In verse 34, the Amorites pressed the sons of Dan into the hills, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. What is going on here? God said he's going to go before them. Why aren't they conquering these people? So that's the big question that should be in everybody's mind, is why isn't, why aren't they, why isn't God going before them? Why aren't they, they took Jericho. So why now all of a sudden is this going on? And it just, I'm saying it all of a sudden only in the context of this class. And we know why, right? Because they lack faith, because there's issues with what's going on with them. So in chapter 2, it says in verse 7, the people served Jehovah all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who prolonged their days after Joshua, who saw all the great work of Jehovah which he had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Jehovah, died, being a son of 110 years. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance on the north of Mount Gosh. And also all that generation was gathered to their fathers, and another generation arose after them who had not known Jehovah, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. So there you go. One generation, and they did not personally see all the great works that God had done. And very next verse, they forsook, verse 11, the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of Jehovah and served the Baals. There it is right there. There's the problem. That is the problem. And this is something that we're going to see again, the repeated pattern, because God will suffer sin for a long time with his people. But as soon as we start seeing this issue with idolatry, he's done with them. And that is what's going on here. They forsook Jehovah, served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And I'll start at verse 14 of chapter 2. The anger of Jehovah glowed against Israel. He gave them into the land of plunderers. They plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of their enemies all around, and they were not able to stand before the enemies any longer. Wherever they went, the hand of Jehovah was against them for evil, as Jehovah had spoken and as Jehovah had sworn, and it distressed them very much. And Jehovah raised up judges, and they saved them from the hand of their plunderers, and that's why it's called the book of Judges. So here's the cycle. God is helping them, and they're conquering. They get complacent, they start worshiping idols, and their faith is faltering, and they start sinning. God hands them over to their enemies. They become oppressed and distressed. They cry out to God. God sends them a judge to deliver them. And that's the cycle that we're going to see throughout the book of Judges. They just can't keep it going for more than a generation or two. It's just like one generation figures it out, and then all of a sudden they forget again. And that's the main message that we see throughout most all of the scriptures. Holding on to that faith becomes so difficult because as human beings, we start to think we want what we want, and a lot of times we go off the rails. Okay. Verse 18 of chapter 2, when Jehovah raised up judges to them, then Jehovah was with the judge and rescued them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for Jehovah took pity because of their groaning before their oppressors and those that crush them. God still loves his people, but he has to be a just God. That's just the way it is. And at the death of the judge, this is verse 19, it happened that they would turn and act more corruptly than their fathers and go after other gods to serve them and bow themselves to them. And they did not fall away from their own doings and from their stubborn way. So that's it. And so we see this cycle that starts to happen. And it says in verse 23, Jehovah left those nations without dispossessing them quickly, and he did not deliver them into the hand of Joshua. And it also says that he left them in there so he could test his people. And it was their own fault. Had they just done what God wanted them to do and taken over the land, they wouldn't have these problems. Okay, and then now in chapter 3, it's basically this list. These are the nations which Jehovah left in order to test Israel by them, all who did not know all the wars of Canaan. And he goes through and talks about that. And he talks about Israel living among the Canaanites and the issues that they were having. And verse 7, the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Jehovah and forgot Jehovah their God. So again, they served the Baals all over again. It's just this repeated pattern over and over again. And when the sons of Israel cried to Jehovah, Jehovah raised up a deliverer to the sons of Israel, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who served them. And the spirit of Jehovah was put on him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war, and Jehovah gave Cushan-Rishathaim, the king of Mesopotamia, in his hand, and his hand had power over Cushan-Rishathaim. Okay, and they had rest for 40 years. In verse 15, the sons of Israel cried to Jehovah. So again, they fall into sin again, and they need a deliverer. And it says, the sons of Israel cried to Jehovah. Even Jehovah raised up a deliverer to them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the son of a Benjamite, a man of his right hand impeded. With his right hand impeded, and the sons of Israel sent a present to Eglon, the king of Moab. So Moab is now oppressing Israel. And Ehud makes this double-edged sword. He straps it on his thigh. He goes in like he's paying tribute to this king, right? The king thinks this guy's he's my puppet tribesman. You know, he thinks that he has dominion over him. And he says, Eglon, I have something to tell you. So Eglon sends everybody out. Ehud goes in and he says, I want to tell you a secret after everybody's out. He says, I want to tell you a secret. Stabs this guy with a sword. And I guess Eglon was so big and fat that he had lost the sword inside of his belly and took off. And the guy fell down dead right there. And the people, Israel was delivered. But this is part of that cycle of obeying God because you need him, okay? And then falling away because you got what you wanted, and now everything is nice and peaceful. There's an old saying, I think, what is it? Hard times create tough men create better times, and better times create soft men. In other words, people who aren't willing to do the hard things that need to be done. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. And of course, Moab is subdued it says here, for 80 years. So in the questions here, when does the book of Judges start? It starts, when Joshua dies. So Joshua dies, and then that generation goes away. Then we start seeing this cycle over and over again of trusting God for a time, and then things get better, and then you fall away, and then you're oppressed by your enemies, and then you start trusting God again because you need his help. So what should we learn here? I mean, think about it, right? What is God trying to say here? So what are they doing in verse 1? They're actually asking God. They're inquiring of God. This is, so that's good. This is in chapter 1. And so that's good. And Othniel marries Caleb's daughter, and he captured the city of Sephir. Israel has trouble driving out inhabitants. Why is this important? Well, just because I said there's obviously an issue, right? The covenant with God was, here's my law, here are the things you need to do them, okay? And this is what I say, we try to downplay obedience in the Christian paradigm, and it's like God hasn't changed. If you don't think you need to do anything, you're mistaken. I'm not saying we're under the system of law anymore, or that we gain God's favor by all the great things we do, like we can add them up. That's not it. That's not it. God's looking for the correct heart in everybody. The issue reveals this issue of faith. It's their faith that is faltering. The faith is only as good as there's, until they get what they want. This is an issue for literally most everybody during this day and time, and back then, and even today, I would say. People looked at God like, he deals with the kings, or he deals with the heads of the patriarchs, and so we need to get with them so we can get what we want. And once we get what we want, then okay, fine. And then they forget about God. Or we're doing so much good, like they're going to leverage something against God to get things. And that's just not how it works. Chapter 2, what happens in the first 3 verses: because Israel has failed to drive out the people, he will not drive them out, because he has an issue with them. And that is, that's kind of the introduction here. That's first chapter and the first part of chapter 2. Israel has an issue, and God starts to reveal what the issue is. The issue is idolatry. And we're going to see that issue play out all through the history, all through this Old Testament history. Always it becomes an issue at some point. They were worshiping Baal, and Baal could be many different gods for specific things. And later, as time goes by, there's the Asheroth as well, and that's another god of fertility, or whatever it could be. And all these different gods become issues. And if you just read Deuteronomy, or any of those, Exodus, any of them, God's telling them, don't worship other gods. Don't do that. And there they go. And they do it anyway. What does God do for Israel in verse 16? He delivers them through this judge. It's a short-term good effect. And that's just, again, the cycle that we're going to see here in the book of Judges. Chapter 3, Othniel was the first judge. Ehud was the second judge, and he's the one who stabs Eglon with the sword. Now, it's probably not a long sword, right, because it had to fit on his thigh. But it was, long enough that it mentions that he loses it in the belly of this king, which is pretty gross. What was Shamgar's notoriety? Shamgar is another judge, but there's no long story about him. It's just that he kills a bunch of Philistines with an ox goad. Oh, another Shamgar, he killed 600 guys. It's interesting. It's just like, we have to include this guy too. But he doesn't have a long story. Israel began a habit of obedience during persecution and disobedience when times were good. How can we sometimes be that way? Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, we can be that way. And that's, again, Jesus brings all of these things out. God expects us to have a level of faith like the Jericho level of faith all the time. And it's not so we can get stuff. It's because, and this is what Jesus brings out. God is not this tyrant. God is wanting to be our Father. Okay? Different thing there. That's a different take than this idea of a God who gives you something. Rather than that, it is a God who wants us to be with him. Big difference. So this is what we're going to see moving forward all through the Old Testament, this idea of, even during the times of kings, and we're going to get into that, where some kings are good, some kings are bad, and it all the straw that breaks the camel's back is always idolatry. There's a lot of things that people do that are not right, that God doesn't like. But he can deal with that. But as soon as you turn your back on God with idolatry, it's over. What's the message there? Because, yeah, none of us fall down before idols, do we? Right? There's no idol in your house. Maybe not. But we need to understand that what is the abstract thought of what is an idol? Well, an idol is anything that we put over God, anything that we worship, that we have this unusual amount of devotion to, that we put over God as important. It's more important than God, whatever it might be. And that is what is that's the message that we find in this Old Testament, in these Old Testament scriptures. So I'm going to leave it there. And we're going to get into the next one. We're going to still be in Judges, I'm pretty sure. And we'll see you in the next one.